Deception. It's such a peculiar thing, isn't it? The subtle art of concealing the truth, of twisting reality ever so slightly. We humans are strange creatures. We long for truth, yet we hide behind our own masks. And here's the paradox. Sometimes the ones we trust the most, the people who are closest to us, are the ones who engage in these little deceptions. It's not always out of malice, but often out of fear or insecurity. A desire to keep the world from seeing something too raw, too real. I remember a time when I believed I could always tell when someone was lying to me. Perhaps you've thought the same. We like to think we're good judges of character, that we can see through the veil of falsehood. But as life has a way of teaching us, reality is far more subtle, far more intricate. A lie is rarely obvious. It slips between words, in a slight change in expression, in the way someone's body turns away ever so slightly. Imagine, if you will, a person sitting across from you. They're speaking, and everything seems fine. But then you notice something, a slight hesitation, a shift in tone, a laugh where it doesn't belong. It's as if the truth is shimmering beneath the surface, almost calling out to you, yet still hidden. And in that moment, you can either turn away, choosing to preserve the comforting illusion, or you can look deeper, daring to see what lies beneath. So let us explore this together, not in judgment, not in suspicion, but in curiosity. Let's examine the subtle signs that someone might be hiding the truth from us. For these little tells, these small clues, are part of the rich tapestry of human behavior. And perhaps, in understanding them, we don't just learn how to see through deception. We learn a bit more about ourselves, our own hesitations, our own illusions. Are you ready to see beyond the mask? Let's dive in. 1. Laughing off serious topics. Have you ever tried to bring up something meaningful with someone, only to have them laugh it off like it's nothing? I know I have, and it's frustrating. At first it might seem like they're just trying to keep things light-hearted or avoid making the conversation too serious. But over time, you start to realize that this habit of laughing things off is more than just a quirky response. It's a way of dodging accountability. When someone brushes off serious issues with a chuckle or joke, they're not just avoiding the conversation, they're hiding from the truth. In one of my past relationships, I often felt disconnected, like we were slowly drifting apart. I'd try to bring it up, hoping we could talk it through, but every time I'd get that same awkward chuckle and a dismissive, "Oh, you're just overthinking it. Relax." At first, I let it slide. I convinced myself maybe I was being too intense, or maybe they were just uncomfortable with these kinds of talks. But the truth was, their laughter wasn't about me or even about keeping things light. It was a shield against having to confront deeper issues. Here's the thing. Using humor to dodge serious topics isn't innocent. It shuts down the conversation, making it impossible to address the root problem. We're conditioned to think laughter is always a good thing, but when it's used to deflect, it creates a barrier to real communication. The more I allowed this to happen, the harder it became to feel connected. It's like a roadblock went up every time I tried to approach the truth, keeping us stuck in surface-level interactions. The deeper issue here is about emotional maturity. If someone can't talk about serious topics without trying to make a joke out of it, they're signaling that they're not ready or willing to be vulnerable or accountable. And that's a big problem. Real relationships need honest conversations, even if they're uncomfortable. If they laugh things off, don't let it slide. Ask, "Why is this funny to you?" Or, "Can we talk about this seriously?" because humor shouldn't be a wall between you and the truth. When people avoid real talk, it's not just a small issue. It's a barrier to genuine connection, and that's something no relationship can survive. 2. Micro-expressions of guilt or fear. I used to think I was good at spotting lies until I learned about micro-expressions. These tiny, almost imperceptible facial expressions can reveal emotions like guilt or fear, no matter how hard someone tries to hide them. Think about it. A slight twitch in their brow, a flicker of discomfort in their eyes, or even a quick tightening of their lips. We don't usually notice these things, but once I started paying attention, I realized how much people's faces can give away. For example, I once had a friend who was late for a meetup. When I casually asked why, they shrugged it off with some vague excuse. But there was a fleeting look of panic, just for a second. It was so brief, but it was there. My gut told me something was off, but I brushed it aside. Later, I found out they'd actually been lying about where they were, and that quick micro-expression was a dead giveaway that I missed. Micro-expressions are fascinating because they're genuine. These aren't practiced, rehearsed responses. They're spontaneous reactions our bodies can't control, even when our minds are trying to be deceptive. Now, whenever I'm in a conversation and something feels off, I watch for these micro-expressions. They might only last a split second, but they're real indicators of hidden feelings. It's like seeing behind the mask for just a moment, catching a glimpse of what's actually going on. It sounds intense, but learning to notice micro-expressions has changed the way I interact with people. I no longer feel in the dark when something feels off. Instead, I trust my instincts and look for those subtle signs of guilt or fear. It's not about being paranoid, it's about being aware. We often talk about listening to words, but sometimes faces tell a much clearer story than anything else. So, if you're getting mixed signals from someone, pay close attention to those tiny changes in their expression. They might be giving you the truth they're not saying. 3. Body language. Body language can say more than words ever could, especially when it comes to honesty. I used to ignore subtle shifts in body language, thinking they were insignificant. But as I became more aware, I started noticing that people's actions often spoke louder than their words. One clear example: when someone's body is subtly turned away from you, even if they're engaged in conversation. I'll give you an example. I once had a friend who, whenever we discussed anything personal or uncomfortable, would slowly turn their body away. It was almost unconscious. At first, I thought I was reading into things, that maybe they just had a weird way of sitting. But the more it happened, the clearer it became. They'd shift away, crossing their arms or even looking around as if searching for an exit. Body language isn't accidental. When someone can't fully face you, it's often because they're hiding something or feeling uncomfortable with the conversation. It's almost as if their body is trying to physically escape the truth. And, just like with micro-expressions, these actions aren't calculated. They're raw, involuntary responses. When you notice someone's body turned away, especially during an important conversation, pay attention. It's a clue that something deeper might be going on. Over time, I've learned that if someone truly values honesty and connection, they'll face you directly, no matter how difficult the topic. They won't shy away or hide with their body. So if someone's angling away from you mid-conversation, it's not just bad posture. It's a subconscious sign that they're not entirely comfortable with the truth, and maybe they don't want you to see it either. 4. Changing the subject. Have you ever been in a conversation where you bring up a serious topic, and suddenly the other person changes the subject. It's like a game of verbal dodgeball. You throw them a serious question, and they instantly shift to something trivial. I used to think they were just scatterbrained or easily distracted, but now I know better. When someone frequently changes the subject during critical discussions, it's often because they're avoiding the truth. I experienced this firsthand in a past relationship. Every time I tried to discuss future plans, where we'd be in a year, our goals, even how we'd handle tough situations, the conversation would suddenly steer towards something totally unrelated, like dinner plans or a random funny story. I brushed it off at first, telling myself they were just uncomfortable with the topic, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Changing the subject isn't just a harmless shift in conversation, it's a tactic to dodge uncomfortable truths. And what I learned was that if someone truly respects you, they'll stay with you in those hard conversations. They won't take an escape route to avoid the issues. Sure, these topics can be uncomfortable, but genuine relationships are built on facing them head-on, not steering away. If you notice this in someone, it's okay to gently bring them back to the original topic. It might feel awkward, but it's a way of keeping them accountable. And if they continue to change the subject, take it as a sign. It's not about making them uncomfortable. It's about knowing that truth requires presence. Real conversations don't hide in the safety of unrelated topics. They're about facing what matters, even when it's tough. 5. Excessive justifications. One thing I've noticed about people who are hiding something is that they often feel the need to over-explain. Rather than giving a simple answer, they pile on details, making their story sound like they're trying a little too hard to be believable. I used to think that extra detail was a sign of openness, but over time, I realized it can actually be a sign of deceit. Imagine asking someone a simple question like, "Why were you late?" And instead of a quick response, you get a long, drawn-out explanation. They start talking about every single red light, the traffic they hit, the exact sequence of events that led to them being late. It's like they're building a wall of words to cover something up. Now, I'm not saying everyone who over-explains is lying, but when explanations feel overly polished and rehearsed, it's worth paying attention. I once had a friend who did this constantly. Every time I asked them something small, they'd go into a monologue of justifications. At first, I thought they were just detail-oriented, but after a while, I started wondering why they felt the need to justify everything so thoroughly. It turned out they were hiding other things, using these justifications as a smokescreen to avoid suspicion. If you find someone excessively justifying their actions, ask yourself why. Honesty usually doesn't need a lot of padding. A straightforward answer is often enough. So if someone gives you an overly elaborate story, consider that it might be covering something up. Sometimes, the more people explain, the less they're actually telling you. Trust your gut on this one. 6. Vagueness when pressed for specifics. Nothing is more frustrating than trying to get a clear answer from someone who's being intentionally vague. You ask a direct question, expecting a straightforward answer, and instead you get something like, "Oh, things are moving along," or "We're in the early stages." It's like they're throwing words at you without giving you any real information. I used to think it was just their way of avoiding the question, but now I know that vagueness often points to something deeper. One time, I had a coworker who loved talking about all the big projects they were working on, but whenever I'd ask for specifics, what companies they were collaborating with, the status of the project, they'd respond with these vague, almost poetic descriptions. No names, no facts, just a lot of empty words. Eventually, I found out that many of these projects were either stalled or completely fabricated. They relied on vague language to keep people from pressing further. Vagueness, I've learned, is a shield. People use it to avoid accountability because it's easier to backpedal on a vague statement than on a concrete detail. If someone truly has nothing to hide, they won't mind giving you specifics. So if you notice someone dodging details, take it as a sign. Ask a few follow-up questions, and if they keep dancing around the answer, there's likely a reason for it. Vagueness can seem harmless, but it's often a telltale sign of something being hidden. 7. Inconsistent stories. One of the easiest ways to spot a lie is by paying attention to inconsistencies in someone's story. If someone is telling the truth, their story usually stays the same, even when repeated. But when someone's lying, they tend to forget details or change parts of their story without realizing it. I've learned to notice these small changes because they often signal something bigger. Once, a friend told me about an amazing job offer they received, with all the perks and benefits. But the next time they brought it up, a few details had shifted. They mentioned a different job title, a new location, and even changed who had interviewed them. These were minor discrepancies, but they added up, making me question the entire story. Eventually, I found out they'd exaggerated parts of the offer, trying to make it sound better than it actually was. Inconsistent stories are like loose threads. Pull on them, and the whole thing starts to unravel. When you notice these discrepancies, don't ignore them. Ask for clarification and see if the story holds up. People who are telling the truth usually don't mind repeating themselves or correcting small details. But a liar's story is often inconsistent because they're trying to keep track of too many falsehoods. Consistency is a hallmark of honesty, so trust your instincts when things don't add up. 8. Defensiveness. Have you ever asked someone a simple question and been met with an over-the-top defensive reaction? I have, and it's almost always a sign that something's wrong. Defensiveness can be a natural response to criticism, but when it's an extreme reaction to a harmless question, it often means the person is hiding something. In college, I worked on a group project with someone who would react defensively every time I asked for an update. Even a casual, "How's it going with the report?" would set them off, accusing me of micromanaging or not trusting them. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe they just didn't like being managed. But over time, I realized that their defensiveness was actually a sign of guilt. They hadn't been doing their part of the project and were trying to cover it up. People who are being honest don't usually feel the need to defend themselves so aggressively. They're calm, straightforward, and open. On the other hand, someone with something to hide will go into overdrive, turning the tables to make you feel like you're the one being intrusive. If you encounter this type of defensiveness, don't back down. Take it as a cue to look closer because, more often than not, it's a sign that something's being hidden. 9. Not listening. Listening is a basic part of communication, but many people don't truly listen. They're just waiting for their turn to speak. This isn't just a conversational faux pas. It can actually be a sign of deception. When someone's lying or hiding something, they often can't fully engage because they're preoccupied with managing their own narrative. I used to know someone who would nod and smile during conversations, but rarely responded in a way that made me feel heard. Whenever I'd ask them something important or try to discuss an issue, they'd give quick, shallow responses or change the topic entirely. At first I thought it was just their personality, but eventually I realized they were hiding things, using this lack of engagement as a way to avoid going deeper. Not listening isn't just disrespectful, it's a red flag. If someone truly values you and is being honest, they'll be engaged in the conversation, actively listening and responding meaningfully. But when they're checked out or only half listening, it's often because they're more focused on what they're hiding than on the actual discussion. Trust your intuition when someone isn't fully present. It's a clue that something might be off. 10. Over-polished details. One of the biggest red flags I've learned to watch for is when someone's story sounds too perfect. Real life is messy and unpredictable. It rarely follows a flawless script. When someone's story is packed with overly polished details, it can be a sign that they've rehearsed it, constructing a perfect narrative to avoid suspicion. I once knew someone who loved telling stories that sounded like they were straight out of a movie. Everything was dramatic and timed to perfection, with every detail perfectly placed. They'd recount scenes with cinematic clarity, down to the exact time, weather, and background noise. I loved the stories at first, but then I started wondering how they could remember everything so perfectly. Eventually, I found out they had exaggerated many parts, crafting these stories to sound more impressive. Over-polished stories can be captivating, but they're often too good to be true. Real memories are rarely flawless. They're filled with small imperfections. So if someone's story sounds like it was rehearsed for the big screen, take a step back. Ask a few clarifying questions and see how they respond. If the details start to unravel, it's likely that they're not being entirely truthful. People who have nothing to hide don't need their stories to be perfect. They just need them to be real. And so, we arrive at the end of this little exploration, our journey through the mysterious terrain of truth and deception. It's fascinating, isn't it? The subtle signs, the nuanced gestures, the half-hidden glances, all small ripples on the surface of a vast, complex human experience. Perhaps now you see that detecting a lie isn't about seeking to expose others or holding ourselves above them. Rather, it's about cultivating awareness, about learning to tune into the delicate dance of honesty and concealment that we all, in our own ways, participate in. In understanding these signs, you're not just learning how to spot a lie, you're inviting yourself to look more deeply, to be more present with others and, most importantly, with yourself. For isn't it true that the more we seek honesty in others, the more we must embrace it within ourselves? The masks we wear, the illusions we cling to, they're not just out there in the world of others. They're within us as well, woven into our own habits and fears. So, I encourage you to reflect. What have you seen in yourself and others that hints at a concealed truth? Where have you observed these small ripples, these delicate signs that speak louder than words? And what, if anything, will you do differently now that you know? Please share your thoughts. I'd love to know what you've discovered, what insights have arisen as we've delved into this strange and wonderful topic together. After all, understanding is something we build together. So, let's keep the conversation going and see where it leads.